motion to excuse Mr. Whitehill, please.
All right, is there a second? Mr. Drummond? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill is excused. You all received a copy of the minutes from the November 17th, 2015 meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to those minutes? Seeing none, they'll stand as approved. There's no petitions and remonstrances this evening, nor any receiving of visitors. We'll move on then to report of city officials. Mayor Berlin.
Thank you, Mr. President. My report will be short. I just want to remind everybody in Salem that there will be a Christmas parade. Begins at 6:30 on Thursday night at Salem High School parking lot driveway. It'll proceed south on Lincoln and wind its way through town. After the parade, please come to the City Green, corner of State and Lincoln Avenue. At the Chamber of Commerce building, there'll be the lighting of the tree, as well as the lighting of the downtown Christmas lights. I hope everybody can come, and I hope the weather is great. If there's any other questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them now.
Any questions for the mayor? Seeing none, thank you. Law Director, Attorney Zellers.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have provided the council 2 pages, 6 and 7, for an amendment to ordinance 66. Those are some changes provided to me by the auditor, so I would ask that before 66 gets a second or third reading, that a motion be made to include those modifications. In addition to that, I would request an executive session for the purposes of discussing litigation issues. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Brown.
I have a comment for Mr. Zellers, if you don't mind.
Well, let me take
I'm
care
sorry, I
of his
can't hear a
motion.
word he's saying.
Let me take care of the motion first.
No, that's, okay, I'm sorry.
There's a motion for executive session
Couldn't hear a word he said.
on litigation after.
said.
Okay, let me talk, okay?
Yeah, you do a good job.
Thank you. There's the motion that's on the floor for an executive session to take place with regards to litigation. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
All right. Mr. Brown.
Thank you very much. Mr. Law Director, when you informed me at the last meeting I had to pay the $40 for Mr. Wolford, I was almost in a state of shock, and I didn't get a chance to get my thoughts in line, so I would like to make a comment this time, but very simple, very plain, and to the point, if you don't mind. Won't probably require a reply either. Okay? I'm looking at the minutes of the last meeting. It says that you responded, the city has an ordinance indicating the costs associated with public records, and like any other citizen, the payment should be made by Mr. Brown. However, I've been on council 8 years. I've requested copies from the HPZ office on many, many occasions, going back to 2006, and I've never been asked to pay for anything I have ever received. And I have copies of all my information at home regarding that. And I'd also like to point out, and I'm sure you're fully aware of this, that Section 149.43 of the revised request for public records, availability of public records for inspection and copying. The following is what Section 149.43 means in layman terms like me. I'm not an intelligent person. The person making the request will be informed of any charges for copies at the time the request for the public records is made. I have never been asked to pay for a copy. The person making the request shall be informed of any fee to be paid. The sign shall be posted in the office stating copying fees, including the cost of bulk copying, and a list of fees for copying the records into other media. There's no such thing posted in the HPZ office. If labor has to be added to the cost of preparation, meaning an outside source will be based on wages of the lowest paid employee assigned to the office. After a long delay in receiving my copies, I suggested, and I repeat suggested, that the administration contact former Mayor Jerry Wolford to get the cassettes copied at his video operation. The day after I picked up the tapes at City Hall, the headline in the newspaper read, "Brown receives copies." The last paragraph stated that the bill would be paid out of the city council contingency funds. That was in the last paragraph of that article. That's why I didn't move any forward. Now, I went to see Mayor Wolford, I paid him $40. Former Mayor Jerry Wolford asked me why I was paying for DVDs when the administration asked him to make them. On November 24th, this past Monday of last week, I went to the HPZ office and asked for copies of the minutes for the BOZA meeting held April 6, 2015. 8 pages were copied while I waited. I was not asked to pay for the copies, nor was there a sign posted indicating a fee for copying services. I would appreciate the $40 I paid Jerry Wolford, withdrawn from the council contingency fund and used as a donation for the K-9 unit for the Salem City Police Department. I am very, very upset, regardless of what this says. I have records of everything that happened. I have never been asked to pay for a copy. I have emails I sent in, requests. Nothing's come back saying I had to pay anything. There's nothing posted in the HPZ office says there's a fee for anything. So this doesn't mean snot. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Mr. Zellers, do you wish to respond? You're not required to, but if you wish, you can. All right. Move on. The auditor has indicated to me prior to the meeting that she does not have anything to report this evening. However, she will take questions if there are any. Are there any? Seeing none. Safety Service Director, Mr. Kents.
Mr. President, I have no report this evening.
Mr. Drummond.
When's the bridge open? I understood it was going to open in November.
No, well, the original completion date was November 30th. That was before the collapse that put them behind schedule. My best guess is it'll be open this weekend. Again, we have to deal with this weather, but
Thank you.
everything's pretty well buttoned up, so it should be open.
Thank you.
Again, it's not our project, so I don't have a date. I have to wait to hear from,
Understand.
ODOT.
Any other questions for Mr. Kent? Thank you. Utilities, Mr. Weingart.
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, honorable mayor. Just wanted to thank the committee for the ordinance you have before you for the supplies for the utilities department for 2016. And also to announce a change in the Utilities Commission meeting, which will be Thursday, December 7th at 3 p.m., where we normally meet at 4 p.m., so it'll be at 3 p.m. That's my report.
All right. Any questions for Mr. Weingart? Thank you. Parks Director, Mr. Faber.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report this evening, but I'm glad to answer questions.
Any questions for Mr. Faber? Seeing none, thank you.
You're welcome.
Council Clerk, Mrs. Bricker.
Oh, thank you, I don't have anything.
Right. That concludes the report of city officials. We will move on then to the report of standing committees. Finance, Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our committee has not met. I have no report.
Streets, alleys, and sidewalks, Mr. Paparotis.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee has not met. I have no report.
Utilities, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. President. A week ago, I informed Mayor Berlin and all the members of council that I was going to ask for an executive session tonight following the meeting to discuss a personnel issue. I'm asking this time for a motion to add that to the agenda for the executive session following this meeting.
All right. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on that?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey? Yes. Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
All right, and I would just indicate that on that executive session and the previous one that Attorney Zellers asked for, that will be conducted at the conclusion of our regular meeting so as to not have to keep anybody sitting around and waiting to come back in for that. We don't have many that would have to worry about that this evening. On traffic and safety, anybody have a report in Mr. Whitehill's absence?
We haven't had a meeting.
All right.
My committee has not met, and I have no report.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rules and ordinances, Mrs. Dickey.
We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow night at 6 PM here in council chambers to discuss ordinance 1199, which is parking spaces and front yard parking.
Very good.
6 o'clock.
Parks, Mr. Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. President. There has not been a Parks Committee meeting. There is no report.
Economic Development, Mr. Nestic.
Thank you. The Economic Development Committee did not meet. They have no report.
And Committee of the Whole.
Same for the Committee of the Whole. Thank you.
Right. We'll go ahead then. That being
Mr.
the-
President, I'm a little lax today because of breathing, but I forgot to ask for a number for my ordinance
Oh,
this evening. I apologize.
that
Thank
is
you
all
very
right.
much.
With regards to that, that'll be number 68.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate
And
that.
That is dealing with the Salem Utilities Superintendent to advertise for bids and enter into contract for the purchase of water and wastewater chemicals and miscellaneous items. We'll move then to the second and third readings of ordinances and resolutions. Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend statutory rules so that ordinance number 64 can be read for the second and third reading tonight.
Is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? Please call the roll.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes,
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
And statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move that Madam Clerk read ordinance 64 by title only for its second and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 64 by title only for its second and third readings this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance authorizing appropriations and transfers as set forth below and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there any discussion? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 64 for passage this evening?
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
yes,
Okay, ordinance 64 passes. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move to suspend statutory rules so that ordinance number 65 can be read for the second and third reading tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
yes,
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
All right, statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move that Madam Clerk read ordinance number 65 by title only for its second and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 65 by title only for its second and third readings this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance to make appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures for the City of Salem, State of Ohio, during the year ending December 31st, 2016, and declaring an emergency.
Is there any discussion?
I just
Mrs.
have a
Dickey.
question. Under that special projects, like our streets project that we're anticipating doing next year with the tax dollars, is the paint for the lines included in that project, or is that in a separate budget line item?
I'll ask,
I
defer
would,
to our auditor.
The painting of the lines would be with traffic and safety. He'll paint those like he does all the other ones.
So did we expand our budget to include 40 streets? Because at $9 a gallon, and if it took 30 gallons just to do what we did on Third Street, that'd be quite an increase in his budget for next year.
I think we'll be fine with that.
Okay.
All right, is there any other questions? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 65 for passage this evening?
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
yes,
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
All right, that passes. Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to accept the changes in ordinance number 66 as detailed on pages 6 and 7.
Is there a second for that? Mrs. Dickey? Is there any discussion with regards to it? All right, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
All right, the amendments are included in that then. Mr. Cushman?
Thank you, Mr. President. I have need some clarification here before I continue. Since we've just made the motion to accept the changes in language as noted, do I need to suspend council rules, or since we did that initially, are we okay?
We would, these are not material changes, so they would not require, as though they had gone back to committee, so you would not require the council rules to be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. President, I move to suspend the statutory rule so that ordinance number 66 can be read for the second and third reading tonight.
All right, is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? Would you please call the roll, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
All right, statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, I move that Madam Clerk read ordinance number 66 by title only for its second and third reading with emergency clause for passage tonight.
All right, Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 66 by title only for its second and third readings this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance to supersede ordinance 150203-06, establishing and adjusting salary, rate, wages, and other benefits for non-represented city employees and non-represented city and elected officials of the city of Salem, repealing all prior inconsistent ordinances herewith and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there any discussion? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 66 for passage this evening?
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
All right, ordinance number 66 passes. Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, ordinance number 67 has already been given its first reading, but it has come to my attention that this ordinance is not necessary, not needed at all. And with that, I would like to discard and eliminate this ordinance in its entirety.
With that, we'll just not give it its reading at this time, and that will take care of the matter in and of itself by not doing that. Is there, given this, is there any questions anybody has for Mr. Cushman regarding this? All right. That concludes the second and third readings of ordinances and resolutions. Move on to the introduction of ordinances and resolutions. I'm going to give him a chance after this. Move on to the introduction of ordinances and resolutions with regards to this. Mr. Brown.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to waive council rules so that ordinance number 68 can be introduced this evening.
All right, is there a second on that? Mr. Cushman, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Council rules are suspended. Mr. Brown.
Thank you. I'd like to waive statutory rules to ordinance number 68. Can have all three readings this evening by title only. I'm sorry. Have all three readings this evening with the emergency clause.
All right, is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? Sorry, Mr. Nestick, I don't always see out of the corner of my eye. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
All right, statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like ordinance number 68 read by title only with all three readings with the emergency clause for passage.
All right, Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 68 by title only for its first, second, and third reading this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance authorizing enter into contract for the purchase of water and wastewater chemicals and miscellaneous items 2016 through March 14th, 2017, and declaring an emergency.
All right, is there any discussion? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 68 for passage this evening?
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
And ordinance number 68 passes. That is the conclusion of introduction of ordinances and resolutions.
Mr. President? At
Mr.
this
Cushman.
time, if it's appropriate, I'd like to make a motion to suspend the second and final meeting of council this month and this year.
All right. Is there a second on that? Mr. Nestick? Madam Clerk, or is there any discussion with that first off? All right, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
All right, that meeting will be suspended. The main thing, we took care of the budget for next year this evening. If anything were to arise that were of an emergency in nature, we could always call a special meeting for that particular issue. Mr. Mayor, I think that you wanted to be recognized.
Yeah, thank you for the departure from your normal method of having the meeting, but at this time, I'd like to make everybody aware that Ordinance 65 included the funding necessary for a K-9 unit for the city of Salem. It's a wonderful thing. I appreciate that. It was passed, and we certainly want to provide as much safety from the drug problems that we have in this community as quickly as possible. In that effort, besides the funding that we have to have for the wages and benefits, I've also explored the possibility of having a fund set up with the Salem Community Foundation to receive funds from people who are willing to donate toward the cause of providing the funds for the dog, the automobile necessary to be purchased for the animal safety, and for use by the K-9 officer, and for any training or any other bills associated with the K-9 unit. So I have a copy of a letter I intend to send to the Salem Community Foundation, and I thought I'd share it with you and with the Salem News. One thing to remember is that any foundation fund that's set up would be a tax-deductible donation, and so if you're planning any year-end donations, please consider the Salem Police Department K-9 Fund with the Salem Community Foundation. Inasmuch as they haven't actually received the letter yet, I'm kind of making a little bit of an announcement ahead of time, but as I said, we had discussions with them, and they're enthusiastic about setting up the fund. So in very short order, I'm sure that they'll be able to receive checks through their tax-deductible 501c3. Thank you very much, and we look forward to getting this K-9 unit started here in the city of Salem.
All right, and the reason I departed from the normal procedure was given the fact that it would have been a little premature, even though I assumed the budget was going to pass tonight, for the mayor to read it during his report, but I thought that this was important that get out to the public and to all of council also. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, sir.
All right, we'll move on then to pleasure of council. Mr. Nestick.
I just want to mention, I'm totally empathetic with Mr. Brown's cause, and separate from, how I feel about that, I just wanted to, it struck me when he mentioned that, $40 will be taken from the council contingency fund, and it's not the fact, $40 is nothing compared to what's in that fund, but there's a spirit to that fund, and being here as long as I have, I was part of the setup of that fund, and it was zeroed out at one time, and then it was re-energized with the idea that those funds would be used for special projects that are brought forward by council members, either for the benefit of their ward or for the benefit of the citizens as a whole, and would have lasting value beyond 1 year and require the approval of all other council members. So I just wanted to put out there so that if we need to discuss this again, that contingency fund is not meant as a slush fund to just pay for things that, come across that maybe could come out of that council contingency fund. So if people feel differently about that, that's fine, but I just wanted to make that statement. It didn't strike me until after Mr. Brown stated it, But, you know, it doesn't reflect on his argument at all. I just wanted to speak specifically to the use of those funds.
All right, very good. Anything else?
Nope, thanks.
All right, Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm very pleased to receive this evening. I've informed the mayor on 2 occasions that I'm fully supportive of the K-9 unit.
Thank you.
And if he sees fit, I would like the $40 that I paid Jerry Wolford withdrawn from the contingency fund of council and placed in the care of this. Thank you. That's not asking much.
Mrs. Dickey?
I just want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, since we will not be back, and I'm really enjoying everyone's Christmas lights that they've put out. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Paparotis?
I'd like to thank the Community Foundation for helping with the drug dogs.
All right, Mr. Cushman?
Mr. President, I would like to thank Rick Drummond, since we're now at our last meeting with you, for your service to the city, for your professionalism, and for just being a consummate gentleman through and through. And also, I would like to remind everyone to shop Salem first this holiday season. That's all.
You're here.
Can we have another round to say thanks to Mr. Drummond,
Yeah.
too, because I
Yes.
forgot.
Thank you. That is fine.
We're just giving the
And Mr. Drummond, I saved you for last.
I don't have much to say. Thanks to everybody on council. It's been a very, I think, good 4 years. I think we all have worked well together. I hope that Mr. Gall will keep the Third Ward's position that going for the next 4 years. I'm sure he will. Thanks again to all the people that have supported me in the past 4 years, both comment-wise, vote-wise, and otherwise. I'd like to thank, and I know this probably won't get reported tomorrow, and it's a shame, but I'd like to thank Mary Ann Greer. This woman comes out at all of our meetings and listens to, it's like watching paint dry sometimes, but she's here, and she reports accurately and fairly, and, you know, I'd like her to get some recognition at once. And with that, apart from whatever I may blather on in the next part of the executive session, I'm done.
Thank you. And I would, too, like to thank you for your service during this time. As Mr. Cushman said, you did it with an air of professionalism and caring about the citizens, not only in your ward, but also citywide. I, too, would like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, since we won't be back until then. And thank all of council for the effort that they put into this year, making it a good year. At this point in time, we'll adjourn out of the regular session and move into the executive session then. Thank you.